Part 1. The Apollo 11 Moon Landing Mystery. Neil Armstrong. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we begin with a journey that's not quite medieval, not quite about inbred royals, but still very much human, very much awkward, and honestly, stranger than you might expect. So, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's glide back to 1969. Because tonight, we're floating in space, slowly. No need for a countdown. No need for fanfare. Just let the engines hum softly in the background of your imagination. We're talking about the Apollo 11 moon landing. Yes, the one you already know about. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. That grainy footage of a man in a bulky suit hopping down a ladder and saying something about a giant leap for mankind. But, as with most things in history, the actual people behind the postcard moment were kind of a mess, which makes them perfect bedtime company. Let's start with Neil. Neil Alden Armstrong, the man chosen to be the first human to step onto another celestial body. Which sounds glamorous, but in Neil's case, it was basically the worst possible job for his personality type. He was shy. Painfully shy. He had the charisma of an unplugged toaster, and he wanted, more than anything, to avoid the spotlight. So naturally, NASA thought, let's make him the global symbol of achievement. What could go wrong? Of course, Neil wasn't born looking like a stoic, stone-faced astronaut. He grew up in Ohio, because apparently every significant American either comes from Ohio or at least had to drive through it once. His father was a state auditor, which means Neil's childhood was filled with the thrilling sound of balanced spreadsheets. His mother, Viola, was one of those classic Midwestern moms. Warm, steady, and the type to make sure her kid wore clean socks before flying planes. By 6 years old, Neil had already gone on his first airplane ride, in a Ford Trimotor. Imagine being 6 and your life trajectory is already locked in. Some kids were collecting marbles. Neil was collecting future astronaut points. From there, he obsessed over flight the way most children fixate on dinosaurs. He built model planes, read aviation magazines, and basically lived in his own pocket-sized Wright brothers fantasy. By the time he was 16, he had his pilot's license before his driver's license, which is one of those little life details that makes you think, wow, that's impressive. And also, okay, but how did he get to the airport? Probably mom's car. Now, Neil was smart. Smart in the way that's useful for engineering but less useful for cocktail parties. He studied aerospace engineering at Purdue, which wasn't exactly Harvard, but it was good enough to churn out future moonwalkers. His education was interrupted when he got called to serve in the Korean War as a naval aviator. Yes, before Neil ever set foot on the moon, he was out there flying combat missions over Korea. And, like a true future space nerd, he kept meticulous notes on every mission, because nothing says thrill-seeking pilot quite like a 3-ring binder. Of course, being Neil, his combat experience wasn't without weirdness. On one mission, his plane was hit, and he had to eject. He bailed out, landed in some farmland, and casually walked back to safety. The farmer who found him had no idea he was talking to a man destined for global fame. To him, Neil was just another polite Midwestern boy who fell out of the sky. After the war, Neil went back to school, finished his degree, and then, because apparently landing on Earth wasn't exciting enough, he became a test pilot. Which meant he strapped himself into experimental jets that had about a 50-50 chance of working and then calmly reported what went wrong. His colleagues admired him for being steady under pressure. Basically, if a plane exploded mid-flight, Neil's reaction would be, that's interesting. Now here's where NASA enters. In the early 1960s, the United States was knee-deep in the space race. The Soviets had already launched Sputnik, sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit, and generally embarrassed the US at every opportunity. So NASA's solution was to find the steadiest, most responsible men they could, strap them into rockets, and hope they didn't die. Neil joined the astronaut corps in 1962, part of the so-called New Nine. These were the next generation after the Mercury 7, and they had slightly more advanced qualifications. Translation, they weren't just hotshot fighter pilots, but also engineers who could do math without panicking. Neil fit right in. Quiet, serious. The kind of guy you'd trust to land a malfunctioning spacecraft, or, frankly, to fix your washing machine without breaking a sweat. Now, here's where the mystery starts to creep in. Neil Armstrong was not chosen to be the first man on the moon because of his sparkling personality. Quite the opposite. NASA needed someone predictable. Buzz Aldrin, Neil's crewmate, was brilliant, but he was also intense. Buzz had a PhD in astronautics from MIT, which is impressive, but he also had the subtlety of a jackhammer. Buzz would have milked that first step for all it was worth, probably launching into a spontaneous TED Talk right there on the lunar surface. NASA didn't want that. They wanted calm, understated, Midwestern reliability. Enter Neil. So, July 1969 rolls around. Apollo 11 is ready to launch. 3 astronauts, 1 giant Saturn V rocket, millions of people watching. And Neil Armstrong, our reluctant hero, quietly boarding the spacecraft like he's just catching a commuter flight to Chicago. Let's pause here, because the idea of being the first person to set foot on the moon is so enormous, so history-defining, that it should be overwhelming. But Neil treated it like another day at the office, which is either admirable or mildly concerning. Imagine telling your grandchildren, "Yeah, I went to the moon once. It was fine." That was Neil. And yet, despite his calm, there were problems. Lots of them. The lunar module, the little bug-like lander named Eagle, was basically a tin can with legs. It had never been tested on the actual moon, obviously, because no one had been there before. Neil and Buzz had to trust that this fragile machine would not only land them safely, but also get them back off the surface again. And here's a fun bedtime thought. If the ascent engine had failed, Neil and Buzz would have been stranded forever. NASA had a speech ready for President Nixon to read in that event. Spoiler, it was not uplifting. But Neil went anyway, because that's what test pilots do. They take risks, shrug, and move on. When the moment finally came, Neil stepping down the ladder, planting his boot into the lunar dust, the world collectively held its breath. The line he spoke has been debated endlessly. That's one small step for man, a giant leap for mankind. He always insisted he said, "for a man," and that the audio just didn't pick it up. But really, it doesn't matter. The words were immortal either way. And in classic Neil fashion, he delivered them like he was ordering a coffee. Calm, unemotional, almost bored. And here's the mystery. Why Neil? Why was this quiet, reluctant man chosen to be the face of humanity's greatest achievement? Theories abound. Some say it was politics, some say it was luck, some say NASA wanted a symbol of modest American decency, not a brash self-promoter. All of which makes sense. But the deeper truth might just be Neil was the safest bet. And safety, when you're balancing on the edge of space, is everything. Part 2. Behind the Curtain of Apollo 11. So, let's float over from Neil Armstrong's quiet Midwestern retreat back to the part where governments, bureaucrats, and rocket engineers were all frantically trying to make humanity's first moon landing happen. Because while Neil was being the calm, reluctant pilot, the people around him were less calm, less reluctant, and definitely less modest. Here's the thing about Apollo 11. It wasn't just science. It wasn't just exploration. It was politics. Pure Cold War chest-thumping wrapped in the flag and launched into orbit. The U.S. wanted to beat the Soviet Union so badly that they basically wrote NASA a blank check. Which sounds nice until you realize blank check in government terms means throwing money at people who still weren't entirely sure how to keep astronauts alive in space. By the late 1960s, the United States had already lost several rounds of the space race. The Soviets sent up the first satellite, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk. The U.S. was playing catch-up. So, President John F. Kennedy, in one of his more dramatic moments, declared in 1961 that America would put a man on the moon before the decade was out. Which was a bold statement, considering the U.S. hadn't even managed to put a human in orbit yet, but hey, go big or go home. And when Kennedy said, "We choose to go to the moon," he didn't mean because it was easy, he meant because it was really, really hard, and also because beating the Soviets was a nice bonus. The funny part? Kennedy himself wasn't actually that interested in space. He cared about winning the propaganda war. The moon was basically a billboard. A very expensive billboard that cost around $25 billion in 1960s money, which today would be, well, let's just say it makes Elon Musk's rockets look like bargain bin toys. So, NASA had the money, the mandate, and a deadline. What they didn't have was a lot of experience. The early Apollo program was riddled with problems. Engineers were rushing, mistakes were made, astronauts were nervous. And in 1967, Apollo 1 ended in tragedy. A cabin fire during a test killed 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, right there on the launch pad. It was a devastating moment, and it made everyone realize this whole moon landing thing was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. After that, NASA doubled down on safety. Every screw was checked. Every system was tested, which meant astronauts had to spend endless hours in simulators rehearsing every possible disaster. Imagine practicing how to land on the moon in a glorified arcade machine that was basically a bad video game with life or death consequences. Now, let's talk about Neil Armstrong's crew. Apollo 11 wasn't a solo mission. Neil had Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins with him, and the 3 of them made up what's arguably the most awkward trio in space history. Buzz, as I mentioned before, was brilliant. MIT PhD, wrote his thesis on orbital rendezvous. The guy could calculate trajectories in his sleep. But socially, Buzz was, a lot. He had an ego the size of a Saturn V rocket and a tendency to talk over everyone else. He wanted to be first on the moon so badly that you can almost hear the grinding of his teeth in the background of the lunar audio recordings. Michael Collins, meanwhile, was the third wheel, the command module pilot, which meant he had the privilege of staying in orbit around the moon while Neil and Buzz got to do the fun stuff. Michael later joked that he was the loneliest man in the universe when the command module passed behind the moon, cut off from all radio contact. For about 48 minutes each orbit, it was just him, alone in a metal capsule, floating in the silent darkness. He handled it well, but still, it's not exactly the dream assignment. Imagine going to Disney World with your friends, and they leave you in the parking lot to guard the car. And yet, Michael became the most well-adjusted of the 3 after the mission. He embraced the weirdness, wrote books, gave talks, and lived a surprisingly balanced life. Which just goes to show, sometimes the person left out of the spotlight ends up the happiest. Now, the big question, why Neil Armstrong and not Buzz Aldrin to step on the moon first? Officially, NASA claimed it was simply because of the way the lunar module hatch opened. The commander, Neil, was closer to the exit, so it made sense. But that explanation feels a little too convenient. The reality was probably more complicated. Neil had a reputation for calm, steady decision-making under pressure. He was the guy you wanted in a crisis. Buzz was brilliant, yes, but impulsive. He loved attention. He loved talking. He loved being the center of the room. And NASA, as an organization, was allergic to grandstanding. They wanted someone who would walk on the moon, plant the flag, read the prepared lines, and not try to turn it into a personal monologue. So Neil it was. The actual descent to the lunar surface was a mess, not that you'd know it from the TV broadcast, which looked serene and steady. In reality, alarms were going off. The onboard computer was overloaded and threatening to crash. The designated landing site turned out to be full of boulders, which is not ideal when you're piloting a fragile tin can that can't exactly swerve like a sports car. So, Neil took control. With fuel running dangerously low, he manually steered the lander to a safer spot, calmly guiding the Eagle down to the surface with about 30 seconds of fuel to spare. It was one of the most nerve-wracking moments in spaceflight history, and naturally, Neil made it look effortless. He later described the whole ordeal as fairly routine, which is classic Armstrong. Meanwhile, back on Earth, millions of people were watching live. Families gathered around televisions, children were told to remember the moment. In the Soviet Union, officials probably threw things at their TVs in frustration. And Richard Nixon, sitting in the White House, rehearsed both victory speeches and disaster condolences just in case. When Neil finally took that famous step, history was made. But here's something people don't always realize. The astronauts didn't actually spend that much time on the moon. About 2.5 hours outside the lander, to be precise, which is less time than most people spend at a bad wedding reception. They planted the flag, they collected rocks, they set up a few experiments, they took the iconic photos, and then they got back inside. Because again, the moon is not exactly a place you want to linger. It's dusty, it's deadly, and the bathroom situation is complicated. The flag itself, by the way, was not designed to last. It was just a standard nylon flag bought from Sears with a little metal rod to keep it upright in the airless environment. After the astronauts blasted off from the surface, the exhaust from the ascent engine probably knocked it over. So, the heroic flag-planting moment? Yeah, that flag is probably lying in the lunar dust like a forgotten beach umbrella. Back on Earth, Apollo 11 returned as heroes. The astronauts were greeted with parades, state dinners, and the kind of worldwide adoration usually reserved for pop stars. Richard Nixon personally called them from the Oval Office, making it what he called the most historic phone call ever made. Which, to be fair, is a strong contender. But the glory didn't last forever. In fact, the aftermath of Apollo 11 was kind of depressing. Neil Armstrong retreated from public life, Buzz Aldrin struggled with alcoholism and personal issues, Michael Collins did all right, but was mostly overshadowed. And the American public, after a brief wave of excitement, they got bored of the moon. Later Apollo missions attracted less and less attention, until eventually, people stopped caring altogether. So, here's the quiet irony. Humanity achieved one of the greatest feats in history, and then moved on. The moon landing was a giant leap, sure, but it was also a one-off performance, a showpiece. And Neil Armstrong, the quietest man in the room, was cast as the star against his will. As bedtime stories go, that's kind of perfect. It's the tale of a reluctant hero, a forgotten flag, and a collective shrug from the rest of humanity. But don't drift off yet. In the next part, we'll wander into the stranger corners of the moon landing story, like the endless conspiracy theories, the astronauts' odd personal struggles, and the curious case of why humanity never really went back.
Part 3. Moon Rocks, Conspiracies, and Astronaut Hangovers. So let's drift away from the parades, ticker tape, and awkward Nixon phone calls, and into the strange twilight that followed the Apollo 11 mission. Because if you thought walking on the moon was the hardest part, well, no. Sometimes it's harder to come home and be famous than it is to risk your life in a tin can 240,000 miles from Earth. The astronauts returned with bags of moon rocks, about 50 pounds of the stuff. They carefully packed them, like souvenirs from a very exclusive gift shop. These rocks were later analyzed, cataloged, and locked away in vaults. A few were given as diplomatic gifts, tiny fragments encased in lucite presented to world leaders. Many of those gifts have since gone missing, which is both funny and depressing. Somewhere in a dusty government office or a pawn shop back room, there's a chunk of the moon sitting in a drawer, forgotten, like a paperweight from outer space. But while scientists geeked out over the rocks, the astronauts themselves had to deal with a much heavier burden: fame. Neil Armstrong, as we've said, wanted nothing to do with it. After a brief world tour where he endured endless banquets and handshakes, he resigned from NASA in 1971. He moved back to Ohio, taught engineering at the University of Cincinnati, and lived as quietly as possible. Which is sort of like Beethoven deciding to retire and teach piano lessons at a community center. Neil avoided interviews, declined most public appearances, and almost never talked about the moon in detail. When pressed, he'd give short, careful answers, as though he were describing how to operate a lawnmower, not recounting humanity's greatest adventure. Buzz Aldrin, by contrast, had the opposite problem. Buzz craved attention. He loved being an astronaut, loved the spotlight, and loved talking about himself, which would have been fine if not for the crushing realization that no matter what he did, he would always be second, always the man behind Neil, always the silver medalist of the cosmos, and Buzz did not take that well. After Apollo 11, Buzz spiraled. His marriage fell apart. He struggled with alcoholism. He bounced through odd jobs, including a stint as a Cadillac car salesman, because apparently selling luxury sedans in Beverly Hills was the logical next step after bouncing around on the moon. Spoiler, it didn't go well. Buzz later admitted he was terrible at it. Customers would come in, and instead of selling them a car, he'd start talking about orbital mechanics. Not great for commissions. Eventually, Buzz pulled himself together. He went through recovery, remarried, wrote books, and reinvented himself as a kind of eccentric space elder. Today, he's that slightly odd uncle who insists humanity should colonize Mars and sometimes throws punches at moon landing deniers. Yes, that really happened. A conspiracy theorist got in his face, calling him a liar, and Buzz, well into his 70s at the time, socked him. Which, honestly, is the most Buzz Aldrin thing ever. And then there was Michael Collins, the man who never walked on the moon, the man who orbited alone while Neil and Buzz got the glory. You might think that he would have been bitter, resentful, forever grumpy at cocktail parties. But no, Collins turned out to be the most normal of the three. He accepted his role, he embraced the solitude of his lunar orbit, he even described it as peaceful. Later, he wrote a memoir that was witty, reflective, and surprisingly charming. Out of all the Apollo 11 crew, Collins seemed the happiest in the long run. Which goes to show, sometimes being left in the parking lot is the best thing that can happen to you. Now, about those conspiracy theories. Because of course there are conspiracy theories. You can't have a world-changing event without at least 10% of the population insisting it never happened. The most famous theory, of course, is that the moon landing was faked, filmed on a soundstage somewhere in Hollywood, probably directed by Stanley Kubrick, because apparently 2001: A Space Odyssey was just too convincing. The evidence offered by deniers usually comes down to things like, the flag looks like it's waving, but there's no wind on the moon, or where are the stars in the sky, or the shadows look weird. NASA patiently explained all these points, many times. The flag looked like it was waving because it had a metal rod holding it out, and the astronauts jiggled it while planting it. The stars aren't visible in the photos because the cameras were set for daylight exposure, and the moon, despite being airless, is blindingly bright in sunlight. But try telling that to conspiracy theorists. The irony is that faking the moon landing in 1969 would have been harder than actually going. The technology to convincingly fake it really didn't exist at the time. But sure, NASA apparently could build an entire fake lunar landscape, perfectly replicate the gravity, and keep thousands of employees silent for decades. Because that's easier than just going to the moon. Neil Armstrong hated these conspiracy theories, not because they made him angry, but because they forced him into the spotlight he despised. He was asked again and again to defend something he had actually done. Imagine living through one of the most dangerous, historic experiences of all time and then having to argue with some guy at a barbecue about whether it was real. That was Neil's nightmare. Buzz Aldrin, as we noted, had less patience. He took the direct approach. Fists. Meanwhile, the moon itself just sat there, silently mocking all of us. Because after Apollo 11, there were more missions. Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Apollo 13, of course, had its own problems and never made it to the surface, despite Tom Hanks's best efforts in the movie. But after Apollo 17 in 1972, the U.S. stopped going. Just stopped. Why? Money mostly. Public interest had waned. The novelty wore off. Congress decided there were cheaper things to spend billions of dollars on, and so humanity's great adventure to the moon quietly ended. Since then, the only visitors have been robots and conspiracy theories. And that's another layer of the Apollo 11 mystery. Why did we stop? Why hasn't Neil Armstrong's first step been followed by colonies, bases, or at least a decent moon cafe by now? Some people argue it's because we found something we weren't supposed to, that NASA covered it up, that Neil's silence was part of some cosmic secret. Others say it's just bureaucracy and budget cuts, which, sadly, is the more likely explanation. Because history isn't usually driven by secrets. It's driven by paperwork. And nothing kills a dream faster than a stack of budget reports. So here we are, more than 50 years later. Neil Armstrong has passed away. Michael Collins has passed away. Buzz Aldrin is still alive, still feisty, still tweeting about Mars. The footprints are still there on the moon, untouched, preserved in the dust. Silent evidence of the time when three awkward men carried the hopes of humanity on their shoulders. And the real mystery, perhaps, is this. Why do we remember the leap, but not the landing? Why do we mythologize Neil Armstrong's calm words, but forget the awkward, messy, very human reality behind them? Maybe because history prefers symbols over people, and Neil Armstrong, against his will, became the perfect symbol. Quiet, steady, and unshakably human. But don't close your eyes just yet, because in the final stretch, we'll drift into the strangest part of all. What happens when history's heroes come home, fade away, and leave us wondering whether the greatest adventure was ever really about the moon at all?
Part 4. The Quiet Legacy of Apollo 11. So, we've stepped onto the moon, planted the flag, confused a generation of conspiracy theorists, and handed out moon rocks like party favors. But history never ends at the big moment. The harder question is always, what comes after? And in the case of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, the after was complicated. Let's start with Neil, because, of course, Neil Armstrong's retirement from NASA in 1971 was abrupt, but not surprising. The man never wanted to be a celebrity. He didn't like interviews, disliked autograph hunters, and hated being asked to give motivational speeches.
After Apollo 11, the world wanted Neil Armstrong to be a walking soundbite, an inspirational poster in human form. But Neil just wanted to mow his lawn, quietly. So he went back to Ohio. He bought a farm. He became a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati. Imagine showing up to your first day of class and realizing your professor walked on the moon. Most students were in awe, naturally, but Neil was understated even in the classroom. He was more likely to talk about structural equations than to tell stories about lunar dust. Students would beg him for anecdotes, and he'd give them none. The first man on the moon refused to play the role of the charismatic hero, and in his own way, that made him even more legendary. Of course, fame doesn't just vanish when you ignore it. Neil was constantly hounded by requests. Interviews, speeches, endorsements. He declined most of them. At one point, he even stopped signing autographs altogether because his signature was being forged and sold for profit. He eventually took to signing legal documents with a kind of squiggle, just to make forgeries easier to spot. Which, again, is the most Neil Armstrong solution imaginable. Boring, practical, effective. He also became embroiled in some odd business ventures. One particularly infamous case involved Neil suing his barber. Yes, his barber. Apparently, the barber had been secretly selling locks of Neil Armstrong's hair to collectors. Neil was not amused. He demanded the hair back, or the profits donated to charity. The case ended with the barber agreeing to write a $3,000 check. And somewhere in this world, probably in a shadowy private collection, there's a tuft of Armstrong hair encased in glass. Neil remained reclusive for the rest of his life. He gave a rare interview now and then, usually very controlled, very serious, but he never cashed in on his fame the way Buzz did. And when he died in 2012, the tributes poured in, hailing him as a reluctant hero, which he was. A man who literally touched another world and then came back to live like your quiet uncle who just happens to fix the tractor when it breaks down. Now Buzz Aldrin, he took the opposite path. If Neil was a ghost, Buzz was neon lights. After his post-Apollo struggles, alcoholism, divorce, the failed Cadillac job, Buzz reinvented himself as a kind of space evangelist. He wrote memoirs with titles like Return to Earth and Magnificent Desolation, both of which sound like rejected prog rock albums. He appeared on television shows. He danced on Dancing with the Stars. He voiced himself in The Simpsons. He even released a rap video with Snoop Dogg and Talib Kweli. Yes, Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, once dropped bars in a rap song. Buzz also became the loudest advocate for going to Mars. He designed conceptual Mars cyclers, spaceships that would permanently loop between Earth and Mars, ferrying humans back and forth. He lobbied politicians, gave speeches, and even wore a t-shirt reading, "Get your ass to Mars." Subtlety was never his strong suit. And of course, Buzz punched that conspiracy theorist in the face in 2002. The man had ambushed him outside a hotel, calling him a fraud. Buzz, then 72, landed a clean right hook. No charges were filed. The police basically said, "Well, you kind of asked for it." And history quietly applauded. Buzz is still alive today, in his 90s, remarried, still tweeting about Mars colonization, still half space hero, half meme. If Neil was the reluctant face of Apollo 11, Buzz became its loud, eccentric mascot. And then there was Michael Collins. Collins never touched the lunar surface, but he became, in many ways, the philosopher of Apollo. His memoir, Carrying the Fire, is considered one of the best astronaut accounts ever written. It's funny, thoughtful, and self-aware. Collins wrote about his solitude orbiting the moon, describing it not as loneliness, but as peace. While Neil and Buzz bounced around in the dust, Michael looked down from orbit, quietly content. After Apollo 11, he worked briefly in government. became the director of the National Air and Space Museum, and later settled into a quieter life, painting watercolors of nature scenes. Unlike Neil, he wasn't allergic to fame. Unlike Buzz, he didn't chase it. He just lived. Out of all three astronauts, Collins arguably handled the aftermath best. Which makes sense. He had nothing to prove. He didn't step on the moon, but he also didn't have the crushing weight of first man or second man on his shoulders. So what do we make of all this? 3 men, 1 mission, 3 wildly different paths. Neil Armstrong, the reluctant hero, forever haunted by his own fame. Buzz Aldrin, the restless showman, forever chasing the next spotlight. Michael Collins, the overlooked third man, quietly content in his orbit. And together, they left behind not just footprints in the lunar dust, but a story that's oddly human. The moon landing wasn't just a triumph of engineering. It was also a messy tale of politics, egos, awkward personalities, and the very mundane struggles of being alive in the spotlight. Because here's the thing, history remembers the event, the leap, the flag, the words. But behind all of that were just 3 guys. Imperfect, complicated, and once the cameras turned off, kind of lost. The legacy of Apollo 11 is bittersweet. On one hand, it's humanity's greatest adventure. On the other, it's a reminder that even our biggest leaps can feel strangely small once we've taken them. The moon landing didn't solve Earth's problems. It didn't end wars or poverty or politics. It didn't even keep humanity interested in going back. It was a shining moment, and then it faded. And maybe that's why Neil pulled away. He understood that the moon was both magnificent and meaningless, a place humanity reached and then abandoned, a dream fulfilled and then filed away like an old newspaper clipping. Neil, ever the quiet engineer, seemed unwilling to mythologize it. To him, it was just a job. A dangerous job, yes, but a job. He took the step, said the line, and then clocked out. So tonight, as you drift off, think about that. The moon up there, cold and silent, still holding the dusty imprints of human boots. A reminder that even the grandest achievements are carried out by people who are shy or vain or quietly philosophical, people who argue with barbers, people who drink too much, people who paint watercolors, people who just want to be left alone. And maybe that's the real comfort in the Apollo 11 story. The men who touched another world turned out to be as flawed, as awkward, and as human as the rest of us, which, in its own way, makes the whole thing even more remarkable. So, dim the lights, close your eyes, and let the moon keep its secrets for now, because the astronauts are gone, the footprints remain, and the mystery of why we went and why we stopped will always hang in the quiet sky.
Part 5. The Ripples of Apollo. When a stone hits a pond, the splash is dramatic, but it's the ripples that last longer. Apollo 11 was the splash. The ripples have been rolling across decades ever since. Let's start with politics. The moon landing was, at its heart, a Cold War stunt. America wanted to beat the Soviets, and it did. But once the flag was planted and the race won, the urgency fizzled. By Apollo 12, the TV networks were already bored. By Apollo 13, the mission was only interesting because it almost killed everyone. By Apollo 17, people were asking why we were spending billions on space rocks when gas prices were spiking on Earth. The program was quietly killed. 12 men walked on the moon, no one went back. That's it. End credits. And yet, Apollo became America's favorite myth. Presidents love to invoke it. Whenever a new big project comes up, curing cancer, fighting climate change, building the internet of the future, somebody dusts off the phrase moonshot. It's shorthand for difficult, inspiring, wildly expensive, and probably doomed. But hey, it worked once, right? Then there's culture. The moon landing shaped movies, books, even fashion. Designers made space-age furniture. Pop musicians wrote songs about lunar loneliness. Hollywood churned out sci-fi with astronauts in shiny suits, even when the real suits were bulky and beige. Apollo shifted our imaginations. For the first time, space wasn't just pulp fiction, it was real. The moon wasn't a goddess, or a mystery, or cheese. It was dust, real dust, with boot prints. But not everyone bought it. Cue the conspiracy theories. Almost immediately, a small but noisy crowd began claiming the moon landing was faked. They pointed at shadows, at flags that looked like they were waving in airless space, at suspicious reflections in astronauts' visors. NASA patiently explained the flag rippled because it had a horizontal rod. The shadows looked odd because of the wide-angle lens. The reflection showed astronauts. But reason never kills a good conspiracy theory. To this day, polls show millions of people doubt the moon landing. Ironically, this only made Apollo 11 more famous. 100 years from now, people may not remember the details of the mission, but they'll definitely know some people think it was faked. That's how myths survive, through their deniers. And then there's the moon itself. The Apollo missions brought back 842 pounds of lunar rock and soil. Scientists still study them. We've learned that the moon is not a dead hunk of rock, but a geological time capsule, preserving the violent history of our solar system. We know about volcanic plains, ancient impacts, and a crust blasted by cosmic radiation. In a weird way, the moon became Earth's diary, pages written in dust and craters. And yet, after Apollo, humanity walked away. For decades, the moon was ignored. NASA focused on shuttles and space stations. The Soviets collapsed. The Chinese, Indians, and private companies started looking skyward again, but slowly. The moon remained lonely, silent, waiting. Now, in the 21st century, the ripples are circling back. We're talking about going back to the moon, to stay, to use it as a springboard to Mars. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, NASA, China, all have their eyes on lunar soil again. Apollo 11, once a Cold War stunt, may end up being seen as the opening chapter of something bigger. But here's the strange part. Even if we do go back, even if we build domes and mines and Wi-Fi towers on the moon, Apollo 11 will always feel different. It was first. It was the leap. And firsts have a magic that sequels can't capture. So as you lay here, sinking into sleep, think of that. The way history ripples outward, twisting from politics to art, to rumors, to science, to billionaires with rocket hobbies. One night in July 1969, 3 men went somewhere no one had ever gone. And decades later, the ripples are still rocking the pond. The splash is long gone, but the water never stopped moving. Good night.